Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. Today we're going to forge a double diagonal peen hammer. This is used primarily for drawing or spreading stock more aggressively than you could otherwise do, and more directionally, I guess you could say, than you could otherwise do with your standard rounding hammer. Of course, this is the same thing that a cross peen hammer will do, but the orientation or the indexing of the peens on this hammer allow for more ergonomic use. Instead of having to cant or hold your material and or your hammer handle at an awkward angle, this allows a more natural stance and better ergonomics. So we're working down this round stock to some square stock because I don't buy square stock. It's much more expensive for the same thing. And this hammer is supposed to be between 3 pounds, 3 and 3.5 pounds. And I'm just getting us a nice billet to work with here. That's the first step. The press works pretty well for this. This kind of cross section is too big for my power hammer, which brings up a little side note. You know, sometimes people ask, should you get a press first or a power hammer first? And now that I, have used a press for several years and a power hammer for less time, but I have both and use both, the answer to that in my mind is, unless you can get a power hammer that's at least 100 pounds, preferably like 150 pounds or more, then start with a press. That's my advice. So we're going to go ahead and punch the eye on this hammer, and I am eyeballing, pun intended, the location of the eye, but it should be in the center, in the middle, lengthwise and widthwise. The punch on this is H13 steel, so holds up a lot better than something like 4140 for this type of work, but you still have to keep it cooled down and lubricated, or you're going to end up with mushrooming at the end and just sticking in general. Go ahead and punch out the other side here, and if everything is done correctly, we should have a nice little plug that comes out, or at least be ready to come out. This is really probably the most important and most difficult stage of the hammer making process, getting that eye centered and even, and oftentimes you'll have to do some correcting as you go, but if you don't have a good eye on your hammer, it's going to make a lot of other things more difficult. Now it looks like that drift is crooked, but it's actually not. The way that it's going in there, trying to keep things straight and centered as we go. So I've got my first drift in, and now I'm going to go ahead and forge down the cheeks or the lugs a little bit here. This is a step that I don't typically do on my hammers yet. I've been thinking a little bit about the hammer design moving forward, but in this particular project it's going to be it's going to be helpful because of how we have to forge the peens on here. So that's looking pretty good just for a regular hammer. I don't think we have quite enough clearance to squeeze that down and release the drift, but give it a shot anyway. So now we can go ahead and forge the peens, and again, this is a diagonal peen hammer. Now in this particular process here, what I should have done is backed up to where I wanted the peen to start, closer to the eye, and forged that down to basically my finished dimension. Instead, I moved out towards the end and forged more material, and that's what really gave me these bad fish lips here. A little bit was probably unavoidable, but I don't think it would have been this bad if I had forged further back, forged more further back initially. See how I really kind of fold that over on the end there. The reason fish lips happen is because you're not forging the mass of material behind the fish lips like you need to. Instead, over the ends. But anyway, we'll get this forged down here, and we do have some extra material on this billet, to factoring in the need to grind some off in the finishing process. So we should be okay. But at this point, the billet's pretty malformed from the peen forging process. So I'm going to try to squish it down a little bit diagonally on the cross section, try to get it closer back to a sort of a square piece, cross section here. So I was able to get it straightened up a little bit, but not as much as it needs to be. Go ahead and clean off some of these bits of steel here around the eye, and also grind off the fish lips before I forge any further. I don't want to leave those in there and create a bigger problem for myself, create a long cold shut there. So if I get rid of these now, we should be able to continue forging on the peens without too many problems. Alright, so now that we have the peens where we want them to for the most part, we can go ahead and straighten this whole thing up, and I'm going to do that continue doing that using the second stage drift here, because that's going to allow us to sort of forge or straighten the hammerhead around the drift. Because what's really important here is that the peens in particular and the hammerhead in general are indexed properly or correctly to the eye. That's where the handle is going to be, of course, and that's what's going to affect the functionality of this hammer. So this here is the final stage drift, and we'll drive that in both sides and make sure the eye is the proper dimensions here. So we're getting close to being done on the forging here. Just need to press in the Fire Creek Forge logo on the side here. And there it is, our forged diagonal peen hammer. So now the next step is to normalize it, which is very important, relieves all that stress we created during the forging process, and normalizes the grain size and structure. Makes for a much stronger and more durable tool. Before we go ahead and harden it, now that we've normalized it several times, I'm going to use the die grinder to grind off the corner around the eye here, so we have a nice radius for when we install the handle. Now, I don't normally grind on my hammers prior to hardening and tempering, but in this case there's a little more material that I would have to remove otherwise, and I want to get the dimensions a little closer to finished dimensions before hardening. So go ahead and grind off some of the material and get those peens cleaned up a little bit, closer to the finished and final dimensions. Back into the forge, heated up for hardening. And this is 1045, so we will be using water. Some groovy editing there. Aggressive agitation in the quenchant to break the vapor jacket and ensure the proper and effective rate of cooling. This is only about a 3-pound hammer, but these heavier cross sections of steel hold the heat a lot longer. So in order to make sure that we don't have excessive auto tempering, in which retained heat in the steel will temper the hardening steel more than we want it to, we want to keep that in the water till it's just about something you can hang on to without burning yourself. So we got to temper it up here, and we'll go ahead and use the twisted wire cut brush, clean off the scale there, and now we can go ahead and grind the peens to the finished surfaces here. Making sure to keep them cool. We do not want to overheat the steel and make it softer than it should be. I make my hammer and axe and hatchet handles out of 4/4 hickory. It's I guess you could call it furniture or cabinet grade. It's a good quality stuff. So anyway, we have to cut that out, blank that out, and build it from scratch. One of the reasons I do this is because you can't buy tool handles with the size of eye that I like to use, that I like to make these with. I like to make an oversized, I guess overbuilt eye for long-lasting durability, and that's just not something you can find without building it yourself. So, which is totally okay because it's a completely handmade tool anyway. So get the eye fit to the hammerhead here. It's just a matter of removing material that doesn't fit, and it takes a couple of times back and forth, but we'll get it set up here. Good rebound on the hammer there, as you'll notice. That comes from good steel and good heat treating, and it makes for the most efficient hammer as you're using it at the anvil. So now it's time to shape the actual handle itself. There's a fair amount of material to remove to make a nice, comfortable, secure, ergonomic hammer handle. I like this particular design. It allows a choked up grip, which is what I typically use. And then if you want to move your hand back a little further, it's got that bell-shaped end on it that keeps your hand from slipping off. That's a feature that I really like, especially when you're using a hammer for extended periods of time. Your hands get a little tired, your grip is not quite as good as it was when you started, and it's easier for that hammer to work its way out of your hand, but that bell on the end there really helps with that. So we need to cut a kerf for our wedge, and we're really close to being able to put this handle on the hammerhead here, or vice versa, as you would say. Use some wood glue to help secure that wedge in there. And then we'll go ahead and drive it all the way home. Of course, I also clean up the end of the hammer handle sticking out of the head. Clean that up on the grinder, make it clean and round it off there, and then, as always, put on a nice heavy coat of boiled linseed oil. Let that soak into the wood, and also coat the steel with it as well. So here's a quick visual demonstration of how this double diagonal peen hammer works, and you'll see that both of my hands are at a pretty natural 45-degree angle, as they would be. And by switching the peens, I can either spread steel widthwise or draw it out lengthwise, and do that more effectively and more aggressively and more precisely than I could with just a rounding hammer. And that is why some smiths choose to add this hammer to their arsenal of hammers. So as always, appreciate you guys watching, and we will see you on the next video.